So, welcome to week 4. Here we go. Today, I'm going to talk about asset creation. And there's some links there that I've put for you to have a little look. A little film that I liked. A few of you guys said you didn't like it, but anyway, that's where we go. And where I get some of my resources from, I put the links in as well, so you can have a look at that. So it's going to be a bit of a broad overview of asset development, because that's a critical part of the VFX pipeline and some of the loops involved with that. And just trying to sort of, continue mapping out how the VFX pipelines design can look and how it can differ and vary. So I've got some stuff in the discussion board this week that will hopefully help you with your assessment. So asset development for films is spread across 3 stages of the production, and it depends what kind of production as how they differ. So you've obviously got to have concept art, maquettes, storyboards and previs, but what happens next is dependent on whether the film is a full-blown animated feature or a live action with VFX components. So if it's going to be a full-blown feature film with heavy VFX components, one of the asset creation components might be this a thing called LIDAR, which stands for Lighting, Image Detection and Ranging. But I noticed there was a number of other acronyms that people use. But basically, it's a piece of technology that creates a 3D scan of an environment. And it can do really, really large environments. I was talking to Mark from who's in your cohort, and Mark works on a mine site, and he was saying, did any of you guys see that film that he shared with you guys about? Yeah,
it's really good.
Yeah, it's awesome. How he's involved with effectively making the Melbourne Cup along with many other people, but he in my one-on-one with him, I was, and I just like to find out how people get involved with this stuff and what their interest is. One of his inroads to this whole business was that he was involved with scanning environments with a drone. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and as kind of, and I hadn't even really kind of thought about that kind of technology before until I looked at this and seeing it's one of the things they do on a live action site is they produce a 3D scan of the whole environment. One of the other things they do is they capture lighting data as well as HDR reference photography. So this LIDAR scan, it basically looks like this. So they fly the drone, and they can even do it with aircraft. So you can do it over really large scale stuff. And they basically just fire a laser across the whole thing and measure detect how long it takes to come back. So pretty clever stuff. Did anyone come across this stuff before, or have I just been living in a cave?
Yeah, I think most people call it LIDAR. But
in the western suburbs, we call it LIDAR. I don't know if that's relevant. You're pretty close to the western suburbs.
Yeah, we work with a drone guy at my company who does mostly video stuff, but also has the capability to do this type of stuff.
What do you use it for?
It's used a lot for urban planning sort of things, where they will take these models as kind of a rough, because the measurement it's like perfect to like a crazy accuracy level. They'll take it as like the base, and then they'll model the new suggested urban plan around it or on top of it. So I guess that's a different way of using 3D in more of a how do you put it, company sense rather than a creative, artistic sense, I guess.
Well, more of an engineering kind of application.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
I think they would use it for real estate, wouldn't they? Or is that just more drones with just normal camera, I guess?
Yeah, I reckon.
Back on your garden that's not got any planning permission. That might be another Western suburbs thing. So the reference photography, I know we've covered this before, but so generally on the set you'll have a VFX supervisor who will collect and oversee photographic reference material using chrome balls, achromatic grey balls, color grids, lens distortion grids, and obviously take some HDR photography. I know we talked about that in week 1. What do I call it? High definition range photography at the time, high dynamic range photography. I've got some more links here. I'm not going to even attempt to disappoint you by playing those. So they're there for you. There's just some stuff talking around gathering that kind of data on a live film set. So, and you see there is in action with a color grid on the film Martian. So VFX projects require assets that are not generally required on full-blown animation features because obviously they don't have live action components. Although interestingly enough, I was thinking about that quite a bit with Alita, that it was kind of at a point where it was almost kind of crossing the line with there was more animation than there were live action stuff. So it was almost kind of like blurring that line quite a bit. But obviously in VFX feature film, there's going to be different sets of different kinds of assets that you wouldn't need in a traditional or a fully animated environment. So there's things like camera tracking and preparing background plates for rotoscoping. Sorry, I was changing my screens. I'm running 2 screens. Sorry. So here's a list of tasks in a live action VFX production, not necessarily in order, but data capture, LiDAR, lighting data, reference photography, and then processing live action footage, plate preparation, rotoscoping and camera tracking, modeling, texture and shader creation, layout, rigging, animation, effects, lighting and compositing. Not necessarily in that order, but that's a sort of not in a linear way, because a lot of this stuff it's very much a simplified version. So whilst that's a rough chronological order, many of these overlap and loop back on themselves. So the asset development is a cyclical and consists of interwoven series of these iterative loops where the processes keep coming back in on themselves. Another aspect would be look dev, a key iterative loop in which the style of characters and creatures and all the props are worked out. Things like textures, hair, fur, and the range of motion that animation rigs are capable of generating is refined before passing on those assets through to shot layout. Match moving, rotoscoping, and plate preparation, and these happen fairly on in the pipeline. So match moving is the process of creating a digital camera within the 3D software, something like Maya. And those digital assets the studio creates, the digital assets the studio create are processed through this digital camera. So they match the live action shot actually on the sound stage. And that differs from camera tracking, because that's the process of gathering that live action data and blending it seamlessly into that process. So the image I've got there is of a sound stage with a green screen, and those little dots there are the motion trackers for on that, so that when you shoot the live action, you gather that camera tracking, the match moving people can blend it in, so that when you blend in your CG components and your live action components, they can use those little dots to match up. Then we've got rotoscoping. Requires the roto artist to accurately trace flat masks around key elements and cut them out of the backgrounds. So, things like characters or props or scenery in live action for the plate, allowing those elements to be cut out of the scenery and recomposited into new digital scenery, just like in the example I've got there. It's quite interesting. I find that term rotoscoping. Have you guys heard of that outside of the digital realm?
I hadn't heard of it before this course.
Yeah, no, yeah, I know that it used to be made, like the original term was because they did it before digital was a thing, right? So and then carried over the term when it started to be a part of software packages such as Nuke and After Effects, I guess.
Yeah, look, when I was at animation school, the very term rotoscoping was probably enough to get you marched off the course, actually, because it was considered quite a dirty word, because it basically meant filming something in live action and then tracing each frame and then replicating that motion. So we always used to think of it as being this sort of kind of slightly grubby term. So I'm having difficulty coming to terms with it in this environment, where it basically just means digitally tracing each live action plate, so that you can cut somebody out of one scene and insert them into another. And that's essentially all it is. So, and obviously shooting on a green screen makes things a bit easier, because you can there's some digital tools to help you do that. So you haven't got any kind of visual mess to compete with. So and also the other thing is, once you've the rotoscoping, is you can cut things into different layers, so that you can do a little bit more with that when in the compositing process. And software you might use for things like that would be Nuke and After Effects, although it seems that After Effects is kind of used for much more kind of lower end stuff. It doesn't seem to be used much in the higher end part of things. Then we've got scene prep, or plate prep, is literally the process of cleaning those live action plates. And what I mean by live action plates is the actual frames, of taking each frame and digitally cleaning up all of the unwanted elements, such as wires and sound equipment, and bits and pieces that might be knocking around. There might be things like street lights, and if it's a period movie, and you've got a modern street light sitting in the background there, that might be an inappropriate thing. So it's literally a very laborious task of cleaning each frame or each plate, and removing all of those unwanted elements. And it might even be removing things like noise and dust and film grain, and adjusting things like lens distortion, especially around the edges. You can often get a little bit of lens distortion. Or it might actually be putting those things in, because if it looks too clean, it gets that cold digital look. So it might actually even be putting in some of those imperfections that make film look real, whereas digital has that sort of super clean look and feel to it. basically it's a sort of a junior compositor role. So it's essentially making the compositor's job easier to create something that's believable or fits in with the direction of the film. And often scene prep people will often transition into a compositor role. On an animated feature, the bulk of the assets are created during the production phase. You've obviously, they share the previs, the pre-production phase of storyboarding and look development. But on an animated feature, most of the assets are created during the production phase. You've got your models and your textures and your rigs and your backgrounds and the effects and your animation, and that's just all the visual stuff. So if you're thinking about assets, you might even think about sound as well. Not that we're even really thinking about sound, because we don't cover that at all in this. We tend to leave that to the sound people. Modeling, I don't really need to say much about modeling, except for it'd be a bit remiss of me not to talk about it at all. So modeling is the process of creating the 3D geometry in animation and visual effects, also known as models and meshes. Typically the model is only responsible for that aspect of the production of literally sculpting and creating meshes for the film. They don't tend to get involved in with most production, high-end pipelines. They only concern themselves with that part of the pipeline. On smaller productions, you might get involved in other things.
I see engons.
You see what? Sorry?
Engons.
Have I got a spelling mistake?
No.
It's bad topology.
Yeah, bad topology. More than four-sided.
Right. Okay. Where are you seeing those? In here,
in the eyes.
Around there?
In the eyes.
Yeah, and it just causes a lot of, especially when you go to rig the character, it just causes a lot of just nasty stuff, especially when it comes to like assigning weights and rigging and just muscle moves and stuff like that, or skeleton moves, I should say.
Cool. So surface details such as color, material properties, irregularities that make it interesting and believable, such as bumps and scratches, are the responsibility of texture artists and shaders. Do you guys even know where this film's from?
Not a clue, to be honest.
It looks familiar.
It's a film that I like to show all my students. I'm going to send you the link to it. I won't. It goes for 20 minutes. It's one of my favorite movies. Bailey, you're going to hate it because it's too quirky for you. It's kind of along the lines of that the crab film. It's made in Melbourne, and it's by a guy called Sean Tan. He's an illustrator. It's called The Lost Thing.
Oh yeah. No, I read one of his books. That's how it looks familiar.
Yeah, I love it because it's got really strong narrative storytelling, but it's great how it's really successfully taken his illustrations and created something three-dimensional out of it. And often that stylistic change doesn't necessarily work very successfully. So I'm going to send you guys a link to it because I love it. So if I don't do that, will someone remind me? Put a note. Lost Thing. Right, cool. I'll send you that. I put this image in it because it's for me, when I saw the film, I just really enjoyed the texture work that had gone onto the models. And it was done in such a way that it was kind of really obvious, and because it had that stylistic sort of feel to it, it was done in a way that they weren't trying to hide anything. So, and it really brought the models to life for me. Yes, where am I? So, the surface details such as the color, material properties, etc. So to do this, 3D software uses shaders, programming that determines how the final model will look when it's rendered. Shaders mimic the way the materials respond to light, creating representations of the properties such as how light will bounce off a surface, how it will reflect, and how some materials have a luminescence to them. So, you know, and it's that complexity of materials. So the shaders is just a great control of amazing software to create that. So it's quite a you know, it's kind of where that sort of science meets art. Whereas texture mapping is a little bit, I guess, more artistic. I need a better word than artistic. I'm not comfortable with that. But texture artists tend to come from that background of people that can use more illustrative and I guess would, you know, be much more comfortable in a traditional art environment, where they're creating textures that might represent materials like wood or glass or metal or rust, etc. And the way they, you know, they use the software for painting onto the surface of a mesh and applying textures like a vinyl wrap on a car, for instance, or a wallpaper. So that's what we call the texture map. So this work always works parallel with diffuse maps, which control the surface color of the model, bump maps used to replicate the fine details like wrinkles and other kinds of fine surface details, and specular maps to use to control the light reflection and absorption. Then we've got UV mapping is the process by which the 3D software understands how the texture is orientated to the surface of the mesh or the polygons. So software such as Substance Painter assist in better workflow for doing this with greater control. And shading is a more technical process than texturing, where texturing is a lot more artistic. Although I need a better word. Give me a better word, guys. What have you got? Nothing.
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 I love texturing though. I like, and
yeah, it's great.
I actually like doing UVs. Everyone's like, "What?"
You need to get checked out. That's not normal.
Well, I did fashion design and I did pattern making. So
that's a good analogy, actually.
it's kind of like reverse sewing.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. I was actually thinking about how you I've done a little bit of sign writing, or not me personally, producing artwork for sign writers around cars and doing those wraps. So I was thinking in those terms,
Yeah.
pattern making too, for sure. And it's about sort of sliding the texture around and getting the texture to understand.
I have tried the Marvelous Designer. It only lasts 30 days though, because I can't afford to buy it. Unless they can get some kind of student version.
I'll put it on the list with flying you down to Melbourne.
Pardon?
I'll put it on the same list as flying you to Melbourne.
Alrighty. Can we add work experience in the US as well?
Totally. All on the same form.
Awesome. And then I'll drop over to Weta and get some work experience there too.
Sure, why not? It's on the way. So I completely lost chatting. I much prefer chatting than talking to slides. Shot layout or shot assembly is when all of those individual assets that are combined to make a single 3D scene. It's during this process that the layout artists will ensure that all of the elements, all of the assets, all of the bits and pieces that have been, you know, carefully worked on and thought through are brought together inside a digital camera. So the shot layout enables the production, and when I talk about the production, I mean all of the team, to actually visualize and adjust accordingly to make sure that the whole thing is coming together. So it's almost like producing one frame of the whole thing. So you can work out all of the superfluous geometry, and all those elements can be eliminated, and a continuity between scenes can be matched up. So it's a process that happens at every stage. So it's very much an iterative step. Begins early on, so things can be roughed out, elements and blocked in animation can be layered in, and that continues through the whole production. So it's also becoming industry practice to start using game engines to rough out the whole movie. So it's combining that idea of previs with shot assembly. So this stuff is evolving as we speak. So shot layout is very much where a lot of the planning and also the checking is done. So it's when things are starting to come together. It's different from doing an animatic or a previs. Previs is seeing the whole thing timed out, where shot layout is just seeing almost like one frame of the whole thing and making sure everything, so you can sort of cast on eye over it, see what needs to be done, see what's working, see what's not, see what doesn't need to be done, because there's no point having, you know, expensive geometry behind a scene or out of shot that's taking forever to render, and actually it's not even being seen. So you can start hollowing out behind things. Then we've got rigging and animation. Rigging is core to the character animator's toolkit, but it's also can be used for rigging, you know, hard surface assets like machinery and vehicles. The rig is essentially the skeleton that sits underneath the skin of the character and determines the range of motion. And it's very much speeds up the animation process. The animator relies on having a good rigging team to put those tools in place for them. So we've got a key elements, the skeleton, which is assigned to various parts of the model's mesh. And then we've got the puppet rig, which is essentially a faster way to pose the character. So the puppet rig controls the skeleton, and the skeleton controls the mesh, if that makes sense. And then we've got another component which is controls the physics of say you've got a character bending an arm, and instead of the mesh pushing into itself in an unrealistic way, it might squash and stretch as the mesh is animated or posed or moved. So this is, you know, it's also good for the secondary animation and also applying physics. Other things to consider. A character's range of motion. So the rigger might, you know, understand that a character has a limited range of motion, if that's appropriate for the character, or an enhanced range of motion, depending on, you know, the nimbleness of the character. So all of that stuff would be brought into the rigging. And also physics. One of the beautiful things I think about animation is that every world that you're working in has its own set of physics. It has its own gravity. You know, this idea that, is it a hard place or is it soft and bouncy? You know, what does the gravity feel like in that environment? And those are some of the things that the rigging people have an input in. Inverse kinematics and forward kinematics, and this essentially controls what follows what. So if you imagine, for those that don't know, IK is, imagine pulling a character around by the hand and seeing what follows what. So it's like you might grab the wrist and seeing the character, you might find the elbow would follow, and then eventually the shoulder would follow, and then eventually the torso would shift, and then the character would lean forward. So that's IK, which is different from forward kinematics, which is when, for say, if you maybe move the character's torso what follows that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've done like IK stuff, but and FK, but yeah, I get it. Hopefully everybody else does.
Mark, I think Mark did a bit about it in our session last week, so it's in the recorded thing. That.
Yeah, and it's just literally how you drag the character around.
Yeah.
So it's like that idea of you move the hand and it will drag the model around. So it's not just kind of posing it like a wooden mannequin. It's about being able to have, and all of that is built into the rigging, and all of the physics and all the parameters are built in. So rigging's really critical to the animation process. Animation. This is really where it's at. This is why, I guess, why you guys are here. That you're here to tell stories. You're here to give life to. So I always go back to this idea that the animation, the root of the word, the etymology or the Latin for animation is to give life to something, to animate something. And once something's rigged, you are ready to start giving life to something. There's a reason why I've used an image of Buster Keaton. Now, Buster Keaton is cited by many animators, many actors, as being the person that was an absolute master of this thing called acting. That's actually what you're doing as an animator. You're acting. And Buster Keaton was an absolute master of that. And a lot of animators will go and study Buster Keaton to see what he's doing. As an animator, it's all about the mime and about telling a story with a pose, being really economical. And if you do yourselves a favor, go and watch some Buster Keaton stuff on YouTube. And what you'll see is a master mime artist tell story and convey emotion with almost nothing. He's the absolute genius at this stuff. So that's why I've tried to keep some visuals on each page, because otherwise it's just a page of text, and that's not very entertaining or engaging. But please go and check out Buster Keaton. The guy that I worked for, Richard Williams, he was obsessed with Buster Keaton, and had a sort of a connection to a lot of his animated work, made references to Buster Keaton. So absolutely do that. Okay, different kinds of animation. Hand keyed, or what I would call pose to pose. So probably the easiest and most common form of animation, which is literally roughing out a pose. So if I was animating a scene, I would literally create stick figures as the basis to my animation, and I would rough out those poses and create good silhouettes. And then once I got the pose sorted out, I put in a breakdown drawing, then shoot some line tests, and then I would rough those out into or just block them out, put some mass on them, start getting them to be a little bit closer to the model of what we're animating. And then I'd pass it down the production line to an assistant and an in-betweener to start putting in, but I'd put in timing charts to say, ease into this, accelerate out of that, and start to work in that way. But obviously with CG, you're doing the pose-to-pose stuff, but you're using the tools within something like Maya to do all of those in between poses and all of those things for you. So it's by far the easiest way. However, a lot of animators say that the other methodology, which they call straight ahead, which is, I guess, a little bit more like stop frame. Has anyone, I know Tom's done some stop frame. Has anyone else done any stop frame animation?
I haven't, but I wouldn't mind.
In another lifetime, once you've made
We've done ceramics, so good with moulding clay. So it would be quite fun to do.
Someone else is going to talk then. Straight ahead is really interesting because the thing about it is it's almost like a destructive kind of methodology. If you, in so much as if you start animating, you can't go back and go, oh, I moved out of that pose too quickly. It's kind of live, that you are setting in your keyframes, and it's kind of harder to, maybe in digital it's a little bit easier to manipulate, but it's got a lot more of a natural feel to it. I think with a lot of animation is there's almost too much control. People that are great straight ahead animators tend to have a really lovely, natural, masterful control over their animation. So all of those people that are doing stop frame animation, they're really flying by the seat of their pants, in so much as they can't go back and put in a couple of in-betweens. They can't go back and put some acceleration poses in there. You know, they're really locked in. What they tend to do though is use a combination of pose-to-pose animation, but then to really block out and get the poses sort of kind of working. With straight ahead, you've got to know where you're going. Where pose-to-pose, you can try things out. But with straight ahead, it works really well when you're doing a lot of this secondary animation and a lot of those, you know, the incidental stuff like cloth and hair and follow through. And because pose to pose can be kind of stiff, you're going from one pose to another, when it's nice when you hit the pose, there's some follow through. Does that make sense? It's hard to know what's clear in my head if it's coming across. It'll make sense when you start animating a lot more.
It makes sense to me. I've done animation, so not everyone has. And I only did a year, so.
I think the thing is of just hearing this stuff, and I guess I'm always conscious of. I know a lot of the content here is absolutely, you know, 101 basic stuff, and you've probably wandered off and started, I don't know, tidying your room or something. Because you go, oh, I know this stuff, but you know, I have to start somewhere, and I can't just go, oh well, I know Bailey knows everything, so I can't, you know, I don't. I'm always conscious of boring people in the room.
I don't know everything. I don't, not even close. I'm actually learning a lot tonight. It's good.
You terrify me with what you know, but anyway. But I'm trying to sort of pitch it. So anyway, I think one of the things about education is that you might, if you don't know something, sometimes you go, oh, that made sense. And then you'll be doing it, you go, oh, hold on, pose-to-pose animation. Oh yeah, now you get that epiphany.
I found that, yeah, when I did CJ Spectrum, certain things just kind of click suddenly. Some things click than others.
Again.
Pardon?
Sometimes it's a case of hearing it all again.
Yeah.
Then we've got motion capture.
Taking a break too can help.
Totally.
For some reason.
Then we've got motion capture. Now, I sort of, you know, before I mentioned about rotoscoping, and rotoscoping for a 2D animator was a bit of a dirty word because it was basically like tracing live action. And so we didn't really think of it as being real. We're going to go, it's sort of cheating. That's almost how I feel about motion capture sometimes. That motion capture is about, you've all seen motion capture suits where, people wearing kind of leotards basically with little balls on them, so that data can be captured by a camera and digitized, and then you can start essentially using that data like a lighting, like a rig, and applying it to a mesh, and so you get this very realistic motion, which has its place, and is obviously very useful. I worked at a software company way back in the 90s, which is, it's amazing I've got all my own teeth, quite frankly. But I remember we had the first motion capture rig in Australia, and it was this kind of, I remember it was down in South Melbourne, and it was this kind of sci-fi thing, and everyone was trying to work out how to use it. I literally remember it coming out of a box and people trying to work out how to use it, and they would get members of staff to try it out, and we would kind of we'd have these kind of Velcro balls on our clothes, and we'd sort of dance around, and we'd get the mocap, and then we'd assign it to a mesh and stitch it together, and it would sort of do all those first tests. So it was meant to be. We saw it as a bit of a threat to us, kind of real animators, because it was kind of like, oh my god, they're gonna do away with us. But essentially, it's just an example of borrowing real motion, and it's really useful in I guess in feature films to sometimes get that real motion and get it, obviously in feature films you're getting something, trying to get something believable rather than stylized. VFX, visual effects, mostly created in post-production, so comes in 4 flavors. Pyro, which means basically anything on fire, explosions, smoke, lightning, that kind of stuff. Particles, which could be dust, or a rainstorm or a snow, or anything kind of, even something like leaves blowing off a tree, that would be particle. Then we've got fluid, water, liquids, lava, anything kind of sort of gooey, or a waterfall, or an ocean. So it's a broad category. And then we've got crowd, so anything that's sort of herd-like, I guess it might be herds of people on horses, or crowd scenes of soldiers, or anything that's just way too prohibitively expensive to create using extras. I've put in there birds, but birds might even be kind of particles in some ways. So they're the sort of the 4 main areas of VFX. And whilst it might be kind of obvious, but we talk about special effects. So special effects tend to be anything that's real, created on set. So a lot of stuff can be done in that way, because it's just easy to literally blow something up, maybe. And then we've got CFX, which is character effects. So that's all that secondary animation stuff, fur, hair. Sometimes it's called grooming. Any thoughts about why I've used this image here? And has anyone ever seen this image here? By a guy called Georges Millet. Have you all gone off and had your tea?
I oddly feel like I've seen it before, but I don't know where from.
I'm kind of the same, but it could be just because it's sort of just a moon face,
It's a popular image in popular culture.
They've used it in the film Hugo.
Okay. The Visual Effects Society use it as a part of their logo, and the reason being was way back in the early days of cinema, and even before cinema, there was this guy called Georges Millet, and he was an impresario. He loved the theatre. He really had, his calling was to entertain, and he was putting on, short little kind of stage productions, and his day job was as running his family's shoe business. And his father just didn't want him mucking around with the theatre. It was kind of like his hobby at night, was to put on, kind of crazy little plays. And one day he stumbled upon a very, very early form of cinema, and he thought, wow, it just blew his mind. It was like kind of the first time he saw VR, it just went like, oh my God, this is incredible. What is this thing? So he went, oh, so you could put on a play, but without there being, actors, and you could just run this thing. And so he spent
a live animation?
Pre-animation. So
live animation or not? No.
Yeah, so it was literally the very, very pioneering days of cinema. Literally when they discovered that you could take sequential images, and there was this thing called persistence of vision, which meant that you got this illusion of movement. And he went, it just blew his mind. These short, 2-minute, 3-minute films that they would project, onto a screen, and people would just go, they'd lose their minds. And he went off and bought all this cinema stuff. It was all sort of handmade in London at the time, and he did that, and he went, this is incredible. So then he started making films. So he was one of the first filmmakers. And then he had this weird thing where the camera had this happy accident where the camera jammed as an actor was moving across the screen, and then started working again. So when he exposed the film and looked at it, it literally looked like the actor disappeared and reappeared on the other side of the screen. And he just went, oh my God, that's amazing. It's magic that this actor has done this thing. So then he was the first person to start exploring this idea of what they called trick photography, that you could literally stop the camera and you could move an actor, or something would happen and it would give the appearance of motion. He made this pioneering movie, I think it was in 1882, could be wrong. There's the Wikipedia link there for you, because Wikipedia is the place of all information. And it was called the Journey to the Moon. And literally, it was this idea of and people were, sort of obsessed with this idea of maybe one day going to the moon. And so it was a stage play which he shot, but he literally did this thing where he essentially kind of animated this this rocket kind of going across the screen. And this is how he did the moon, which is this sort of moon face guy with like kind of, I don't know, with a custard or something on his face. Fantastic movie. But the reason I'm crapping on about this stuff is, and why I get kind of passionate about it, is because he is thought of as being the originator of visual effects. He was the first person to go, oh my God, you can do this thing. So that's why I've made a little homage to him there.
I just put a link into the movie.
Cool.
A Trip to the Moon.
A Trip to the Moon.
1902.
Thanks for that. I literally, when I'm sharing the screen, I cannot for the life of me get the chat up. So it all comes up to me afterwards. And I go, oh, right, you guys were there. You're all chatting away in the background. Cool. Okay. Lighting. That's where all of the assets start coming together and stitching everything together and allowing, the whole story to be told. So as well as simply allowing you to see what's going on, because let's face it, without lighting, you're kind of sitting in the dark. It's critical to the storytelling. So it's a little bit like music, that you only miss it when it's not there. It sets the tone and the mood of the story. Without lighting, what's the weather doing? What's the time of day? That stuff's critical to storytelling. Is it warm or is it cold? Have you noticed that the light changes? If you see a photograph, you can tell if it's in the morning or it's at the night. It's in the night. Can anyone offer me some suggestions of, in the evening, what is the dominant hues of light?
There's usually more pinks and orange, like warm sort of, and it depends on the time of year too.
On the time
summer sunset's different than winter sunset.
Totally. And what about the morning? What does morning light look like?
It's clearer. It seems clearer than in the evening. Clearer? It's
what's the color temperature?
Yolac says blue.
It's cool tones in the morning.
Totally.
Yeah.
Have you considered why that is the case?
After being cool overnight?
Anyone else got any thoughts?
I actually have no idea at all.
No, that's okay. This is the stuff I find fascinating.
I'd like to know. Yeah, this is interesting.
It's literally the physics. If you imagine the globe, right, the world, right, the planet, and as the sun's coming up, because the air in front of the light waves are generally cooler, the light is traveling through cold air, and it refracts. It lets in light. It lets light waves that are in that bluer end of the spectrum travel easier than the redder hues in the morning. Obviously, the sun goes up and the light changes. It gets warmer as the air warms up. At the end of the day, there's the airs become hotter, and as the light waves are traveling through that warmer air, the redder end of the spectrum, the color spectrum, is allowed to travel through the air. So that idea of when you see a prism, say you got a crystal or something, and light waves hit it and it turns into a rainbow. Yeah, it takes white light and it refracts. Yeah.
Yes.
And so it's doing that physics thing of slowing down the light waves at a different rate. I'm not trying not to get sort of too into physics, because I'm certainly not going to do the science thing, but it's that idea that it slows the light waves down at different rates. That's why it breaks white light into a rainbow. That's essentially what's happening. So warm air tends to look tends to look redder than cool air. And I suppose the color psychology is that we instinctively, when we see something blue, we go, oh, that's cold. And we see something red, we go, oh, well, that's hot. And that's literally what's happening. So how does this affect how lighting is in a movie? Is that by controlling the lighting, one, you're helping tell the story. You're adding that almost subliminal layer to the storytelling, that you know what time of day it is. Is it cold? Is it warm? If it's cold, there's a sort of something ominous about that. If it's warm, there's something different about that. You know, it affects the whole storytelling. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, right, you know, a number of us went to see Alita last week or over the weekend, and looking at the color hues that are in this image as part of the movie. So there was a sort of a key plot change as opposed to that, which was earlier on in the movie. Can you see how this is sort of, it's more focused, it's kind of, it's a lot more austere, and it's, you know, there's a lot of blue light to it. Whereas that's when she's kind of,
much warmer.
yeah, and it's a little bit more homier, and you can sort of see that that's really quite deliberate in the movie. So obviously lighting is important as part of the storytelling process, but also if you're matching digital to live action, you need to be able to understand the physics of light, and those lighting people they're amazing about, you know, playing with light and controlling it, and doing all of those subtle subliminal things of making things look believable, combining assets that are gathered together on the live action shoot. So they're taking the achromatic balls, the chrome balls, the HDR photography, and gathering that, using that and the color charts as well, bringing it all together to make it make sense. This is a slight departure, but kind of got me thinking about color palettes in films. And have you thought about how when you're designing a movie, that there is absolutely a color palette that works within the film, that there's a general kind of color spectrum or a general color palette, but then you've got these other color notes to it. So when you're making a movie, or if you're working on a movie ever, they work within a color palette. So obviously I had a lot of experience with 2D, and I would go into the paint rooms, and they would spend a lot of time almost kind of like the guys when they're doing the layouts, and they create one image, one complete flattened image of what the thing will look like. The paint guys would do that, and they would create these color palettes that they would iterate and get right until they got the exact you know, the sign off on that color palette for the film. And somebody that I really look to a lot. Are you guys familiar with Miyazaki Hayao? Everyone goes, yeah, because you all know who Miyazaki Hayao is, yeah? Totoro?
Not me.
Do yourself a favour. I'll put this down on here as well. Totoro. He's a Japanese master of animated filmmaking. He is known. He was up there with the guy that I work for, Richard Williams. He's known as like the world's greatest animator. One of the things I really love about his work is his color palettes. I don't think there's been a filmmaker ever that's done a better color palette than Miyazaki Hayao. His color palettes are sublime. So absolutely worth seeing.
Is this where a colorist comes in as well?
Absolutely.
Or is that, yeah?
Well, there's technical colorists, and there's kind of directorial colorists. So it's sort of a double-edged thing. This is really interesting. If you're thinking about how color tells a subliminal story through a movie, that at key points, as you know, movies have plot points within them. That there's you establish the character, and 20 minutes in you get a key plot change, and 20 minutes later there's a framework that you can put over narrative storytelling. And here is one particular movie, The Martian, and they've averaged out frame by frame across the duration of the movie, so you can see the whole film told as almost like an infographic throughout, from the start to finish, of what's happening. But you can sort of see there's key stuff, like there's red moments, and then there's cool moments, and it's kind of interesting. If you go to this website here, moviebarcode.tumblr.com, obviously this came from page 21. Have a look at it. It's sort of going off tangent a little bit, but I thought it was too good an opportunity not to introduce you to that as well. That's really cool. Okay. Now, I know you guys don't really get involved in the discussion forums. Can you give me some feedback around discussion forums and how you feel about them? Because as educators, we're always trying to work out what's going on with discussion forums. We get some people that get super active on them, and other people don't get into them at all. Help me be a better teacher. Tell me about your interaction with discussion forums, useful or not.
I think you just need something to start I think the first question, I've got two kind of main thoughts about it. The first one is, do you want it to be truly a discussion, or do you want it to just be us answering questions, aka like a place to basically post homework? Like last time was like, you kind of gave us the 4 kind of questions to compare, and that was good. I learned stuff that I didn't know before, and kind of clarified some stuff that I thought I knew, but it wasn't really discussion. It was more of a, okay, here's what I've learned.
Yeah, sure.
Because we're all kind of talking about the same thing. A lot of us are going to come to very similar conclusions. But the other option is actually having a discussion where there is some debate or back and forth. It's something that's not so objective; it's more subjective kind of thing.
Yeah, a bit of both. I think for me, it's pedagogically, it's a good practice to get people to get involved with discussion forums. We're all here to learn, I guess, and that's what we're doing. And if it was just about me, preparing slides and reading off them, that's we all know that's kind of boring. But when we throw out questions and to get you thinking about them, if I just said, oh, could you go and think about these? You go, oh yeah, I'll do that. But if you've actually got to kind of start, logging on and thinking, oh, what is the VFX pipeline? And answer that question for everyone to see, there's a much deeper learning.
For it.
I'm sorry?
Breaking up. You cut out there for a sec. I don't know if it was just me.
Yeah, you're going to have to repeat yourself, Simon, what you just said.
All right. Yeah, sorry. To answer your question again, look, pedagogically, it's better if we get you to be engaged with things like discussion forums. We pose questions and you consider an answer and write. That's a good thing. So there's a much deeper learning there, and it just makes it a little bit more interesting than me just talking at slides. It means that you've got to go away and think about it. I know there's you guys are really good. You've bonded really well, and you've got your study group, which is amazing, and I'm super pleased about that. But I think the discussion forum is really good, and so we do things like, bit of a heads up, and I've mentioned this before. lecturers will give you higher marks for engaging in the discussion forum. So if you're wanting to get, go from a distinction to a high distinction, get really active in the discussion forum, because it gives us metrics and we can see student engagement. I mean, I've posed these 4 questions, and if you sort of sit there and kind of think the answer through in your head, I don't know if you've engaged or not. So then when I'm trying to give you a grade, I go, oh, I don't know, I didn't get anything. And it's hard online, so I can't see kind of, I can't tell if you're just kind of, if you're hanging on every word, or if if you're throwing the vacuum around. I have no idea. If you are throwing the vacuum around, it'd be great if you could come around my house though. So
I'm all for the forums. I'm curious to know whether Mark and Jeremy have access to those forums.
Yeah, they do. They do. I suspect they don't probably use them. Just the nature of their classes is that I think they're less likely to use them, because they've got the pre-made stuff that they deliver. It's a high quality, massive investment in DG Spectrum to put that together, and then they've got the one-on-one, and so they probably think that if you've got a question, you're going to either email them or you're going to turn up. So it's a different kind of.
The students can still use it for like getting some feedback or whatever from each other, right?
Yeah,
totally.
So definitely.
I mean, you can answer some animation questions and probably modelling, maybe. I don't know. You've done modelling, haven't you?
Me?
Yeah,
totally.
So get really stuck. Jeremy uses CG Spectrum have a Slack channel, and everyone's been put in there.
Okay.
They've got their own special group just for us, as well as the general and all the other animation. Like there's specific groups for different discussions. So I could probably get you, Simon, an invite to that as well, unless you already have.
Yeah, look, the thing is about that, right? I've got email.
Yeah.
I've got discussions.
Yeah.
I get text messages.
That's just, I think it's a good for the students. I think the other students to get involved with the other CG Spectrum students as well.
That's good, yeah.
And there's lots of information floating around about all sorts of stuff, CGI. So it's a good, everyone would have got emails because they're all invited to the Slack room. So
yeah.
And that's where Jeremy said he was more likely to be found if someone needs
that's good. As long as you're getting what you need from Jeremy and your CG Spectrum mentors, I'm super happy about that. You guys are really good at either texting me or emailing me, and you know that I generally get back to you pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that's good. The discussion forums, where the education providers just love you to be engaging.
Yep.
So I know I've stopped sharing my screen. Shall I stop? I'll stop share it again. So very specifically, I've asked these questions not because it's my job to sort of put something up on the discussion forum, but I think if I was to start answering the first assessment myself, I think this is not a bad starting place to say, what is a VFX pipeline? Explain it back to yourself. It's that kind of like if you were trying to explain this to a family member and they said, what are you doing at the moment? Oh, I'm doing VFX pipeline. What's that? Well, a VFX pipeline is blah, 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 blah. And so it allows you to consider your thoughts and to arrange your thoughts in a very cohesive way, rather than sort of umming and ahhing and using the word like 5 times in one sentence. You can be really clear about it. What is the core purpose of the pipeline? The core purpose of the pipeline is blah, 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 blah. How many variations of the pipeline can you think of? That's a pretty good question, because there's lots of different kinds of pipeline design. So we've sort of talked about 3 today. So there's the full-blown animated film that has a particular kind of pipeline, and then you might have a film that has a blend of CG animation plus visual effects that has a different kind of pipeline. Then you might have just a pure visual effects film, so there's a live action with those. So that's another kind of pipeline. So, you know, we've looked at those in the course of this evening, and that's been sort of kind of happening in the background. And then there's the games pipeline, and there might be variations of the games pipeline. I know that's something that you're particularly interested in, Sarah.
Well, more VR, but also game like
VR indeed.
Yeah,
that's a great one.
It's similar, I guess. It's just
well, it's a different kind of asset creation. So, but they arranged the asset creation and the processes differently. So I think it's really useful to have that. So discuss how those pipelines vary. So if you all pitched in, you are all actually helping each other do the assessment. So that's the whole point of that.
Sweet.
Yeah, Bailey and I are kind of into the forums already.
That's cool. People are hardly doing them for critical thinking either. So, like, I'm the only one who's commented on like this week's. As in, well, Sarah's commented on tomorrow's. I've commented. I'm like the only one that's commented on the 3 we had for last week.
That's because he knows the doors.
Yeah, so even that's a special use case.
The doors. I have to ask if he actually met Jim Morrison. Pierre knows the doors. He said that in the lecture that I watched last night, this week's lecture.
He knows of them, or he actually knows?
He actually knows them. Like, he said that he was friends with them.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. He's a really interesting cat, actually.
And then I couldn't focus on the rest of the lecture because I was like, oh my God, he may have met Jim Morrison. Sorry.
All right, cool.
Doors are like next best to Led Zeppelin to me.
Do they light your fire?
They totally do.
That's funny. That's very funny. All right. Does anyone have any questions before I stop recording? I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to stop recording because it gets too big to upload.
No, all good.
Cool. Right. Stopping recording.